Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in the staff meeting, 3 years into Katie Morrison's employment at Mercy General in Denver. Not to her face. Never to her face. To the assembled medical board, her voice still echoing through the room like she wasn't standing in the hallway outside, reorganizing patient files with hands that could disarm an IED in 47 seconds flat. She didn't flinch. She didn't flinch because flinching was a tell, and Katie Morrison had spent 18 years and 4 months, to be precise, learning that survival meant stillness. He had no idea who he was insulting. And he was about to find out in the worst possible way. The morning shift began at 6:45, same as always. Katie pushed through the glass doors of Mercy General's east entrance, Denver's pre-dawn air carrying that particular chill of early autumn, carrying the smell of diesel from the ambulance bay and something underneath it that only the trained nose would catch, that metallic undertone of spent adrenaline from whatever trauma had rolled in at 3 in the morning. Her badge hung at the lanyard's end, laminated photo showing a face that belonged to someone named Katie Morrison, civilian nurse, RN, certified in critical care. The badge was real. 3-year employment record, employee of the month twice, performance reviews that used words like diligent and unobtrusive and reliable. She'd crafted that identity the way she used to craft operational cover, detail by detail, hole by hole, until even the background check couldn't find the seams. She moved through the corridors with the kind of economical motion that made people stop noticing her after the first few seconds. A physical therapist named Marcus had once said she walked like she was moving through water, no wasted energy, no sound. He meant it as a compliment. She'd taken it as a data point and adjusted her pace to be marginally less fluid. Drawing attention meant questions. Questions meant answers. Answers meant complications she couldn't afford. The ICU wing came into view, the cardiac unit passed that, floor numbers ascending as she passed the elevators. 3rd floor. Her floor. The place where she'd kept her head down for 156 weeks and counting, learning the rhythms of hospital bureaucracy the way other people learned their address. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and something sweetly chemical, fabric softener from someone's scrubs, running cost about $2 per wash. Katie opened her locker, number 42, and reached inside. The jacket hung there, a civilian thing, dark gray cotton, the kind no one would look at twice. She touched the patch, fingers finding it by muscle memory in the inner lining where she'd sewn it 3 years ago. Faded olive drab, the outline of a trident barely visible, the letters worn almost to illegibility. She pressed her palm flat against it for 3 seconds. Breathed in. Breathed out. That was the ritual. That was the only way she let herself be Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison for 2.5 seconds before she became the nurse again. Just a nurse. A title Dr. Sterling had wielded like a scalpel in a meeting she wasn't supposed to hear. The morning round began at 7. Dr. Sterling moved through the ICU like a man who'd paid money for his shoes and wanted everyone to know it, Oxford's, probably Ferragamo based on the heel strike, expensive enough that the clicking on tile sounded almost like a metronome counting down to something. Katie stood 3 steps behind him, chart in hand, doing her job. Reading vitals. Recording observations. Being present without being noticed. Invisible. The way she'd learned to be when invisibility meant you lived to see the next sunrise. He was talking to the attending physician, a man named Reeves who wore his tension like a second coat. The new admits from yesterday, Sterling said, voice carrying the kind of authority that came from knowing that when you spoke, people listened. The Green Beret in 314. Chen, is it? Jacob Chen, Reeves confirmed. Combat hearing loss from an IED in Sanjin. Left ear completely deaf, right ear at about 20% functional. They've got him on a pain management protocol and he's scheduled for cardiac clearance this afternoon. Is he? Sterling's tone shifted, something underneath it that made the fluorescent light seem to buzz a little harder. Then we'll expedite that. Katie didn't move. Didn't change her expression. But something in her chest tightened like a fist, or like she'd been holding her breath for longer than she realized. 314. She knew because she'd reviewed the charts at 5 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but verify that the man with her name tattooed on his right forearm was stable, oxygenating well, his heart rhythm clean. The man whose last image of her was him screaming her call sign while diesel fuel burned 20 feet away. The man she dragged through gunfire in Sanjin because that was the job and the job was all she'd ever been good at. They reached room 314 at 7:43. Sterling pushed through the door without knocking, the kind of entrance that announced he owned the room. Jacob Chen was awake, head elevated, his right arm draped across his stomach where the tattoo sat like a secret only one other person in the world could read. His eyes tracked Sterling's movement, then the attending, then settled on Katie as she came through the doorway last. She kept her face neutral. Blank. The face of someone collecting data, observing vital signs, performing the mechanical functions of her employment. "Mr. Chen," Sterling said, voice loud, the kind of loud people use when they're talking to someone they think can't hear them properly. Overcompensating. Insulting without meaning to, or meaning to, there wasn't a way to know with Sterling. "I'm Dr. Sterling, Chief of Surgery. Just checking in on your progress." Jacob didn't respond immediately. His eyes tracked Sterling's mouth, trying to read lips perhaps, or maybe he'd just learned to wait for the actual question. Katie stepped slightly to the left, better angle, and saw the moment his eyes found hers again. The moment recognition tried to happen and failed. She saw his mouth twitch, like he was trying to place her, and then nothing. Nothing at all. He was looking at a nurse in scrubs. A background detail. A person whose face was already fading from memory. "How's the pain?" Sterling asked, back to normal volume now. On a scale of 1 to 10. Jacob looked back at the doctor. 6. Better than yesterday. Your people here have been taking care of me. His voice carried a slight rasp, cigarettes maybe, or just the warm quality of someone who'd been to bad places. There's been a little communication issue. I've got hearing aids but the left ear is a total loss. I can read lips but the background noise in here makes it hard. Katie stepped closer to the bedside. I can have the environmental volume reduced during rounds, she said quietly. Her voice pitched low, the way she'd trained it, not submissive, just efficient. I can also arrange a communication board if that would help. Or written summaries of medications and changes. Sterling's head turned. Slowly. Like he was registering her presence for the first time, and he didn't much like what he was seeing. That won't be necessary, he said. Standard rounds are fine. We're not in a children's hospital here. The word sat in the room like something toxic. Katie didn't flinch. Didn't let her jaw clench more than half a millimeter. She was trained to absorb fire, verbal or otherwise, to process insults and continue mission execution. But something in Jacob Chen's face changed. She saw it. The way his eyes narrowed slightly, the way his fingers gripped the sheet a little harder. With respect, Doctor, Katie said, and the respectful tone was so perfectly modulated that no one would catch the razor underneath it. Accommodations for hearing loss are standard of care. There's no reason not to implement them. Is there? Sterling smiled, and smiles like that usually meant someone was about to lose something they didn't know they still had. Well, let me be clear, Miss Morrison. I don't adjust my rounds based on specific patient preferences. That sets a precedent I'm not interested in establishing. Mercy General runs on a system that's worked for 42 years. I'm not about to alter it because one patient needs things to be easier for him. He said it loud enough for the attending to hear. Loud enough for the two residents trailing behind to hear. Loud enough, Katie suspected, that Jacob Chen could read lips well enough to catch the disdain. She felt something settle in her chest, cold and familiar, the same thing that had settled before the operation in Sanjin. Before extraction. Before everything fell apart. She touched the patch through her jacket, not obviously, just a hand against her ribs for a moment, and then she moved back to the margin of the room where doctors didn't have to think about her. We'll keep him stable, Sterling continued, back to Jacob now. Cardiac clearance will come through by this afternoon. After that, it's just standard monitoring. He turned away, already moving to the next patient, the next room, the next opportunity to remind someone that he was the important one in this building. Katie followed, the invisible nurse again, the person who didn't exist on Sterling's radar except as an obstacle to the natural order of things. The halls of Mercy General were filling up now. Shift change approaching, the morning fully arrived, the kind of institutional hum that comes from 300 people doing triage and sutures and all the small violence of keeping people alive. Katie made note of the interaction, logged it away, filed it in the part of her brain that was still trained in threat assessment. Sterling was the type who used authority as a club. Classic narcissist, probably had something to prove, probably had sponsors being the polite word for people who benefited from having someone like Sterling in a powerful position. She'd seen the type before. Men who needed the world to work exactly one way or they fell apart. By lunch, everyone knew about the bet. Someone in the nurse's station had heard Sterling talking to one of the attending physicians, heard him say the word so clearly that repetition was inevitable. The narrative spread like medication entering a bloodstream. Dr. Sterling, apparently feeling charitable, had declared he would give $1,000, actual cash, actual money, to any staff member working at Mercy General who could provide evidence that Katie Morrison quit her job within the next 7 days. 7 days. 368 hours. 22,080 seconds. He'd framed it as a kindness, probably. A test of how long a certain type of person could last in a hospital environment. A nurse who didn't understand hierarchy. A nurse who pushed back when she should just accept. A nurse who was clearly going to break under the slightest pressure because people like that always did. Katie heard about it in the break room around 12:30. Marcus, the physical therapist, mentioned it in that careful way people have when they're discussing something they know is deeply unfair. He's essentially betting you'll quit, Marcus said, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. It's insulting. It's motivational, Katie replied, and she meant it. She meant it in the way that people who've stared down actual threats understand the word. She kept her voice level, her hand steady on the cold bottle of water she held. Around her, the break room continued its daily rhythms. Someone's lunch alarm going off. Beeping. The fluorescent lights humming their endless white noise. All of it background. All of it just noise to train yourself to ignore. By the end of shift at 6:15, Katie walked out through the same doors she'd entered, the badge hanging at her lanyard's end, the patch still sewn inside her jacket, still untouched by any hand but hers. 7 days. She'd survived worse timelines with worse odds. She'd survived extraction routes that were nothing but hostile terrain. She'd survived the kind of dehydration that made hallucination seem like a reasonable option. She could survive Dr. Sterling's contempt for a week. She could survive it for a month. She could survive it standing on her head in a hole if that's what the job demanded. But then she saw Jacob Chen in the hallway outside his room, moving slowly with the help of a physical therapist, and she saw his eyes track her for exactly 2 seconds before he looked away, not recognizing anything except perhaps the vague shadow of a nurse passing by. And she understood, with the clarity that had once made her invaluable in combat situations, that surviving Sterling was the smallest part of what was coming. Something in the pitch-black corner of that understanding, the one she kept locked away where it couldn't complicate her cover identity, whispered that Jacob Chen was a timer too. A different kind of deadline. The kind that didn't measure in days. The bet lasted exactly 23 hours. Katie arrived for her morning shift at Mercy General with her hand still steady, her scrubs freshly laundered, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat she couldn't afford to feel. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and institutional eggs, the same smell that had greeted her every morning for 3 years, but today it carried something else, anticipation, the way a room smells before a storm. Dr. Sterling was already there, holding court near the medication cart where 12 staff members were prepping for rounds. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. "I'll bet anyone here $1,000 that Nurse Morrison quits within a week," he announced, loud enough for the entire North Wing to hear. "She doesn't have the spine for real medicine." I give her 5 more days before she realizes she's out of her depth. Katie stood 6 feet away, her hands continuing to fill syringes with the precise rhythm of someone whose muscle memory had been forged in places that didn't exist on any map. The needle slid into the rubber port. In, withdraw, cap, place. In, withdraw, cap, place. One measured breath expanded her ribcage. Her eyes didn't flicker toward Sterling. She didn't acknowledge the nervous glances from the other nurses, the way they suddenly became very interested in their own work. She said nothing. That was the first mistake he made, assuming her silence meant fear. The next morning, Katie sat alone in the cafeteria at 06 for 5 hours, reviewing patient files before her shift, a cup of black coffee cooling beside her plate of scrambled eggs and wheat toast. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead, that particular hospital frequency that never quite stopped vibrating in your skull. She was reading through Jacob Chen's overnight notes, vital stable, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, no new neurological changes, when Dr. Sterling approached her table from behind. He bumped her tray with his hip, hard enough to be intentional, soft enough to claim accident. The coffee spilled across her scrubs in a hot arc. The fruit cup tumbled to the floor, rolling beneath an adjacent table. The plate clattered against the plastic surface, and in that moment, that single calculated moment, Sterling dropped Jacob Chen's chart at her feet like he was discarding trash. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had probably felt like authority once, before the world started moving too fast for men like him to keep up. "I need it updated with actual medical observations, not your feelings about how special you think this deaf patient is." The entire cafeteria went silent. Katie stood slowly. Her movements had the controlled precision of someone who'd learned long ago that speed was less dangerous than emotion. She looked directly at Sterling, not defiant, not submissive, but present in the way that made junior officers uncomfortable. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her voice like still water, like the surface of a lake right before something breaks through it. "When you're done performing, patients still need care." She picked up the chart, wet with coffee, the pages already starting to curl. She handed it to him, her movements neither hurried nor slow, each gesture the work of someone who'd moved through chaos and came out the other side with her sense of proportion intact. Then she walked out of the cafeteria, her scrub stained, her heart rate exactly where it should have been. The other nurses didn't applaud. They didn't even look at each other. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the worst part at all. The following morning, Sterling found her outside Jacob Chen's room during the shift change. His approach was different this time, not performative, not for an audience. This was personal. His voice dropped to a register that made the attending nurses pretend they couldn't hear him, though they could, though they leaned slightly closer to their vital sign monitors with the intensity of people trying not to be present. "I've noticed you spending extra time with our deaf veteran," he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore like armor. "What is it, some kind of savior complex? You trying to prove you're special?" Katie's hands were steady at her sides. Her breathing hadn't changed. "You're not special," he continued, his jaw working the words like they were something he needed to chew on. "You're barely competent. Actually, you're a liability. I've been meaning to tell you, you don't belong on my surgical rotation." He stepped even closer, and Katie took one measured breath, the kind of breath that came from 32 months of understanding that oxygen was a tool, not a luxury. When she spoke, her voice had descended an octave, had shed every ounce of deference she'd been wearing. "Mr. Chen deserves the same care as every patient here, which is why I'll keep providing it." Sterling's jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted from its normal banker's tan to something deeper, something that suggested blood pressure medication wasn't doing its job. He pulled a leather notebook from his coat pocket, the kind of thing that screamed old money and old power, and wrote something in it with deliberate slowness, making sure she saw him do it. "Insubordination," he said, his voice flat now, which somehow made it worse. "That's going in your file. Consider yourself removed from any high-acuity patients until I see some attitude adjustment. You'll work nights." Overnight rotation. Effective immediately. 3 nurses witnessed the exchange, their eyes performing that awful dance between Katie's calm face and Sterling's reddening neck. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath it, fear, probably, or the particular brand of tension that comes from watching authority figures realize they don't have any over certain people. Katie returned to her work without another word. But she could feel the shift, the tectonic movement of institutional machinery grinding into motion. He'd made his first move beyond public humiliation. He'd weaponized scheduling. He'd started using the tools available to someone with his position. He was going to escalate. By that afternoon, Katie discovered the memo in her locker, typed on official Mercy General letterhead and dated that morning. It was from Dr. Sterling to Patricia Graves, the chief nursing director, requesting a formal review of Katie's questionable decision-making patterns during patient interactions and her concerning tendency to prioritize patient comfort over established protocols. The memo noted 3 specific incidents from the past month, each one a moment where Katie had advocated for a patient, where she'd done exactly what her oath required. She read it once. Twice. Then she carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was regular. But the faded unit patch inside her jacket lining suddenly felt very heavy, like it was pulling her toward something she'd been trying not to remember. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing that Sterling was already making calls. Men like him always did. They had networks built over decades, phone numbers of hospital board members who owed favors, consultants who specialized in personnel problems, administrative mechanisms that could quietly dismantle a career without ever raising their voice. And she'd given him exactly what he needed, a reason that sounded official. A paper trail. A narrative that framed her as unstable, as a problem that needed solving. The worst part was that she'd expected it. The absolute worst part was that she'd been trained for this, had lived through versions of it before, battles fought in memo form instead of in the streets of Sanjin, adversaries wielding clipboards instead of weapons. Different theater, same war. But Jacob Chen, the deaf green beret with scars that matched hers in ways he could never know, was still here, still vulnerable, still counting on her to show up. And Sterling didn't know that yet. He didn't know what he'd just activated by pushing her into a corner. He thought she was just a nurse. He thought the bet was still in play, the $1,000 still on the table. He had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea the investigator would find nothing. Dr. Sterling sat in his office at 2:06 p.m., sleeves rolled to the elbows, phone already dialing before his fingers had stopped trembling with rage. The morning's insubordination still burned, that moment in the hallway when Katie had simply walked past him, when his authority had bounced off her composure like rounds off body armor. He'd made the bet in front of witnesses. He'd thrown that chart at her feet like a king casting down a peasant. And she had simply continued her work as if he were background noise, as if he were nothing. The $1,000 wasn't the point anymore. The point was that she had to break. Everyone broke. Everyone understood that hierarchy meant something, that his position at Mercy General meant something, that 32 years of climbing meant he didn't have to be questioned by a nurse who wore scrubs like they were armor. Patricia Hendricks answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice came through the speaker warm and practiced, the voice of a woman who understood favors and debts the way other people understood breathing. Sterling, good to hear from you. Patricia, we need to talk about protocol violations at Mercy General. He kept his tone light, conversational, the voice of a concerned physician. Specifically, I'm concerned we may have hired someone whose credentials weren't properly vetted. A pause. The sound of her breathing shifted slightly. She knew what was coming. 2 years ago, Sterling had buried a malpractice complaint that would have ended her surgical career. A patient had coded during her procedure, complication, not negligence, but the documentation was soft. He'd had the case file quietly archived, had spoken to the risk management team, had made sure the family received a settlement that didn't require testimony. Patricia Hendricks owed him her career. Who are we talking about? Her voice had tightened. Obligation had sharpened it. Katie Morrison. Nurse, 3-year tenure, no obvious issues on her surface record. But I'm wondering if we should conduct a more thorough review of her credentials. Educational background, previous employers, any gaps in her work history. He let the suggestion breathe. Given what happened during that incident 2 years ago with your case, the risk management scrutiny we avoided, I'm sure you understand the importance of proper vetting. The silence stretched 3 full seconds. Then, I'll speak to the board chair. We can schedule an emergency review. He hung up and dialed the second number from memory. Board member David Rothschild answered halfway through the first ring. The man was always available, always hungry for the sense of importance that board service provided. Sterling explained the situation differently this time, emphasizing patient safety concerns, the necessity of credential verification in nursing staff, the liability exposure of hiring someone whose background might not withstand scrutiny. How serious is this? Rothschild asked. Serious enough that I'd feel negligent not reporting it to the state nursing board, Sterling said. It wasn't quite a threat. It was the shape of one, the shadow it cast. By 3:15 p.m., Sterling had filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Board of Nursing, a document written in precise medical language, requesting an official investigation into whether Katie Morrison had performed medical procedures outside her scope of practice, whether her credentials had been properly verified, whether her licensure was legitimate. The paperwork was thorough, professional, lethal. The private investigator came next. Ron Blakely had worked with Sterling before, a thin man with the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, the kind of man who knew how to dig without leaving marks. Sterling hired him by phone and explained what he needed: complete background check on Katie Morrison, employment history, military service if applicable, education verification, any gaps in timeline, any sealed records, any name changes. How deep? Blakely asked. As deep as it goes, Sterling said. I need to know everything. And I need it fast. What Sterling didn't know was that Ron Blakely would spend the next 4 hours making phone calls that led nowhere. Katie Morrison's employment history before Mercy General simply ceased to exist. No military records. No childhood address. No college transcripts. No social security number trace before a specific date in 2019. Her background was a wall of nothing, classified so far beyond Blakely's clearance level that when he tried to access certain databases, he got error messages he'd never seen before. By 6 p.m., Blakely would call Sterling back with 3 words: she's got protection. But Sterling didn't know that yet. At 4:03 p.m., Michelle Torres, HR Director at Mercy General, received an email from Sterling requesting an immediate meeting with Katie Morrison present, urgent administrative matter, confidential. Michelle read the file Sterling had prepared, the allegations, the concerns, the paper trail he'd begun constructing, and her face went pale. This wasn't a performance issue. This was institutional defense. This was the kind of thing that required documentation. Katie was paged at 4:17 p.m. while checking on Jacob Chen in the ICU. The deaf green beret lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling steadily, the monitors displaying a heart rate that had stabilized since morning. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder, a gesture he could feel through the mattress, and then she left, not knowing she wouldn't return to this room again. The administrator's office occupied the 3rd floor, a space designed to feel important and neutral simultaneously. Sterling sat beside Michelle Torres, both of them watching as Katie entered. She wore her scrubs like a second skin, hospital badge still clipped to her pocket. Her jacket was folded over her arm, the one she'd brought from home 3 years ago, the one with the unit patch sewn inside the lining, pressed against the fabric like a secret. Katie, we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised, Michelle began, reading from a document Sterling had prepared. The allegations were vague enough to be safe, specific enough to damage, unauthorized procedures, scope of practice violations, questions about credential verification, concerns about patient safety decisions made without proper supervision. Katie didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She sat completely still, her hands resting in her lap, steady as surgical instruments. Sterling watched her carefully, waiting for the moment when the composure would crack. But it didn't. She simply listened, her eyes fixed on a point slightly above Michelle's shoulder, her breathing unchanged. "Your badge is being confiscated," Michelle said. "You're placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation. You're not to enter hospital premises or make patient contact until the review is complete." Katie asked one question, her voice level and quiet: "Is Jacob Chen receiving adequate monitoring?" Sterling smiled. "That's no longer your concern." She nodded once, stood, and walked out. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. The only thing that moved was her jacket, which she pulled on slowly as she walked through the corridors of Mercy General, one final time, the unit patch settling against her heart as she passed through the emergency room doors. The rain started at 5:42 p.m., the kind of Denver storm that rolled in from the plains like something alive and furious. Katie drove to Greenwood Cemetery without stopping, without playing music, without thinking about anything except the GPS coordinates she'd memorized years ago. The graveyard lay silent beneath the downpour, the grass slick and streaming with water that ran downhill toward the older graves, the ones that had been there long enough to sink slightly into the earth. The headstone read, "Thomas Morrison, U.S. Army, beloved husband." No dates. No rank. The stone was simple granite, the kind that didn't call attention to itself. She knelt in front of it and let the rain soak through her scrubs and jacket, let the water stream down her face and mix with something else, something she didn't acknowledge even as it fell. "I saved him again," she whispered, her voice disappearing into the storm. "And it still wasn't enough. I'm sorry. I failed." The wind didn't answer. The rain just continued, hammering the earth like applause, like forgetting, like the kind of mercy that comes too late. She stayed there until her core temperature had dropped enough to make her hands begin to shake, not from emotion, but from the pure physiological response to exposure. Then she stood and walked back to her truck, where she sat in the dark and waited for a phone call she didn't know was coming, from people she'd spent years making sure wouldn't need to find her. The monitor alarm started as a whisper and became a scream. Jacob Chen's ICU bed erupted at 2:13 a.m., not the steady beep of routine checks but the urgent staccato cascade that meant something inside his chest had shifted wrong. The attending physician on call, Dr. Reeves, was 30 seconds away. Katie Morrison was 2 miles away, sitting in her truck in the rain, her phone dark, her suspension notice still in the passenger seat with her badge clipped to it like a severed hand. But Sarah Chen had texted at 11:16 p.m., "Dad's not responding. Vitals dropping. Night staff ignoring call button. Please." Katie had driven back to Mercy General 20 minutes later through Denver traffic that moved like spilled blood, red lights all the way. She'd come through the service entrance, no badge meant no electronic record, no security camera timestamp that mattered. Just a woman in civilian clothes moving through hallways she'd walked for 3 years, her presence as invisible as she'd trained herself to be. Jacob's room had been exactly what she expected, for line running thin, monitor showing drift, his breathing shallow and compensatory. She'd adjusted the drip rate, repositioned the lead on his chest wall, and his oxygen saturation had climbed from 86 to 92 within 4 minutes. His body had recognized what his mind couldn't, that someone trained had arrived. She'd been about to leave when the screaming started down the hall. The trauma bay doors had slammed open and nurses were calling for crash carts, for blood products, for someone to page surgery. Katie had moved toward the sound against every survival instinct screaming at her to move the opposite direction. Through the reinforced window of the trauma bay, she'd seen him, a man on the gurney with a chest wound weeping dark blood, and when his fever-bright eyes had lifted and locked onto her face through that glass, his body had gone rigid against the restraints. Then came the Pashtu, rapid, terrified, the words of a man watching a ghost materialize in fluorescent light. The night jinn, the interpreter had translated, his voice fracturing. "She killed Khalid. She pulled their man from the fire outside Sanjin. That woman. She is the ghost." The trauma bay had frozen. Nurses mid-movement. The attending turned. And through the chaos, Katie had heard boots on tile approaching from the east corridor, heavy, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this. Dr. Sterling rounded the corner with his smile already in place, triumphant as a man watching dominoes fall in the pattern he'd designed. His eyes had found her in the hallway and that smile had widened. "You violated your suspension," he'd said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a predator who's cornered his prey. "That's grounds for immediate termination and criminal trespass. Police are being called." He'd reached for his phone, thumb moving toward the screen. That's when Sarah Chen's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Senior Chief Petty Officer." The hallway had gone still in a way that made the fluorescent lights above seem to buzz louder. Sterling's hand had frozen. He turned toward Sarah, confused, as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Sarah Chen stood in the center of the hallway, 28 years old, ICU nurse, daughter of a deaf Green Beret, holding her phone up so everyone could see the photograph on its screen. Her father's right forearm. The tattoo. A woman's name in military lettering, and below it a faded photograph of a younger Katie in desert camouflage, her face half turned away, her hands gripping a rifle with the ease of someone for whom weapons were extension, not anomaly. "He showed me this when I was 16, Sarah had said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "He said the woman who saved his life carried him 300 meters under fire. Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison." The words had hung in the air like a held breath before a jump. Sterling's mouth had opened. No sound had come out. His eyes had moved from Sarah's phone to Katie's face and then back again, as if the math wasn't adding up, as if the quiet nurse in scrubs and the ghost in the tattoo and the woman standing before him couldn't possibly be the same person. A nurse named Rebecca had picked up Zahir Ahmed's file with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she'd read from the intelligence briefing attached to his medical history. "Patient was present during a 2019 engagement outside Sanjin," she'd said. "Involving a female SEAL specialist assigned to DevGru. Position classification remains sealed." She'd taken a breath. "It says the specialist extracted 3 wounded personnel while under sustained fire from enemy combatants." The trauma bay doors had opened and Marcus Webb had stepped out, 45, former Army Ranger, working hospital security for 8 years because he'd learned that watching over people was the same skill set whether you were doing it with a weapon or a radio. He'd looked directly at Katie and spoken with the precision of someone giving a military briefing. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. Rebecca had continued reading, her hand shaking hard enough that the paper rustled. "Silver Star," Marcus had added. 2 silver stars, Rebecca had corrected, her voice almost a whisper. "Purple Heart," Marcus had continued. "Joint Service Commendation Medal." Each word had landed like a hammer strike. The crowd of staff had grown, 20 people now, pressed against walls and around corners, mouths open, breathing suspended as if they were watching someone's entire identity reassemble itself in real time. Rebecca's voice had cracked. The engagement resulted in for enemy KIA, including a high-value target identified as Khalid Nazari. The SEAL specialist was critically wounded during extraction. She'd had to grip the file with both hands. She was declared dead for 90 seconds on the medevac bird. The hallway had gone absolutely silent, the kind of silence that happens when 100 small sounds stop simultaneously, when people stop breathing and moving and existing in any way that requires noise. The heart monitor from the trauma bay had been the only sound, steady and indifferent, doing its work while history reassembled itself around it. Then the elevator doors had opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. 2 men in dark suits had emerged, Special Agents Lawson and Torres, FBI, badges visible on their hip belts, their presence radiating the particular authority that comes from working for people with acronyms. Agent Lawson had addressed the hospital administrator, who had appeared in his office doorway like a man emerging from a bomb shelter to survey the damage. Katie Morrison's presence in Denver is part of a protected witness relocation under federal oversight, Lawson had said. Dr. Sterling's attempts to investigate her background triggered multiple security alerts at the bureau level. "We need to speak with him immediately." Sterling's face had drained of color so completely that he looked like a photograph losing its pigment. He'd taken 1 step backward. Then another. His eyes had darted toward the east corridor as if calculating the distance to his office, to an exit, to anywhere that wasn't here. That's when Marcus Webb had spoken again, this time to the hospital administrator. "Sir, you should also know that Dr. Sterling attempted to delete security footage from the past 2 weeks. Every instance of harassment. Every moment he knocked her tray. Every second of the chart he threw at her feet." Marcus had paused. "I saved every frame and filed a report with the State Medical Board this morning. Also sent copies to the Colorado Medical Review Board and the Denver Police Department." Sterling had turned to run. Agent Lawson had simply stepped sideways, positioning himself between the doctor and the corridor with the ease of someone trained in tactical blocking. "Not yet, Doctor," he'd said. The former Taliban fighter's eyes locked onto Katie's face across the trauma bay, and the room fractured into chaos. His fever-bright pupils dilated, recognition flashing like a defibrillator shock. He began shouting in Pashto, his voice hoarse and urgent, the words cutting through the beeping monitors and bustling trauma team like shrapnel. "The night Jinn, she killed Khalid, she pulled their man from the fire." The interpreter, a young man named Rashid who'd worked at Mercy General for 3 years, went absolutely pale. His clipboard clattered to the tile floor. He stepped backward, away from the stretcher, away from Katie, his hands raised slightly as though the identity itself was contagious. Hospital security moved immediately, 3 officers converging on the trauma bay to contain what everyone assumed was a patient escalation, a safety issue, a manageable problem. They didn't understand what they were looking at. Sarah Chen heard the commotion from the recovery wing 2 corridors away. Her father had been stable for 6 hours, his vitals climbing steadily, the crisis phase transitioning into the long slow work of healing. She'd stepped out briefly to call her mother, to tell her that yes, Dad was going to be okay, that the female nurse everyone had been talking about had somehow known exactly what to do when the attending physician froze. Sarah knew her father, knew him as the quiet man who brought her coffee at 7 in the morning before her shift at the law firm, who taught her to drive with patience that bordered on supernatural, who never spoke about the war except for the names of men who didn't come home. When she heard the commotion escalate, when she heard shouting and the specific tone of security responding to threat, Sarah moved toward the sound without thinking. She walked into the trauma bay hallway just as a hospital security officer was radioing for backup, just as the interpreter was backing toward the wall, just as Katie stood motionless beside the stretcher with a composure so absolute it made the air feel pressurized. Sarah stepped forward and said one phrase in crisp, measured Pashto, the language her father had whispered to her as a child, the language of lullabies and stories he thought she'd forgotten. "Senior Chief Petty Officer." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent bay humming its mechanical rhythm. The Taliban fighter stopped shouting. The interpreter's hand dropped to his side. The security officers exchanged glances, confused by this young woman in business casual who'd just addressed a combat veteran with his opponent's rank. Sarah's father's former team leader, a man named Clayton Graves who'd taken a job in hospital security 2 years ago to stay close to Jacob Chen without ever saying why, stepped forward from the back of the group. Graves was 62 years old with a beard gone white and hands that had held weapons on for continents, and he looked at Katie with recognition that ran deeper than memory. He opened his mouth and named them like he was reading from a wall of the fallen, speaking each designation like it was a prayer. Navy Cross. The words landed like stone. 2 silver stars. Another breath. Purple Heart. The silence that followed was the silence of men who'd stood in the presence of something they'd thought they'd lost forever. Within the hour, 2 FBI agents arrived at Mercy General in an unmarked sedan that pulled directly to the administrative entrance. Agent Sarah Lawson had dark hair pulled back tight and the bearing of someone used to moving through rooms and making them smaller by her presence. Her partner, Agent Marcus Chen, had no relation to Jacob despite the shared surname, carried a tablet with encrypted security protocols, and spoke to Administrator Richard Mora with the tone of someone delivering information rather than asking permission. They sat in Mora's office on the 14th floor, looking out at Denver spreading beneath them like a circuit board, and Lawson explained with bureaucratic precision that Katie Morrison's presence at Mercy General was part of a protected witness relocation stemming from classified naval operations. She explained that Dr. Sterling's investigation into Katie's background had triggered federal alerts, automated systems designed to flag exactly this kind of civilian inquiry into protected persons. She explained that the investigation was ongoing and that any further interference would be treated as obstruction of a federal matter. Mora's face had gone the color of hospital walls. He'd known Sterling for 14 years. Sterling had been his colleague, his social peer at hospital fundraisers, a man whose authority had seemed absolute and unquestionable. Now that authority was revealed as tissue paper, shredded by a federal presence that made the room feel smaller and colder. Lawson placed a folder on his desk. Inside were photographs, Sterling knocking Katie's lunch tray to the floor in the cafeteria on March 14 at 12:43 p.m. Sterling standing in the hallway outside patient rooms on March 16, March 17, March 19. Sterling accessing the security office at 11:48 p.m. on March 21, the night Katie had been suspended, moving with the purposefulness of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The next person who walked through that office door was Marcus Webb, Army veteran and hospital IT specialist, carrying a laptop and the tired expression of someone who'd been monitoring data streams for the last 72 hours straight. Webb had served as a signals intelligence specialist with the 35th Signal Brigade and had recognized something in Katie Morrison that made him sit up straighter when she passed, the particular way combat veterans move through civilian spaces, like they're always noting exits and distances. When he'd heard she'd been suspended, when he'd learned about Sterling's investigation and the deletion attempt on the security system, Webb had done what soldiers do, he'd covered her 6. He'd activated a backup protocol on the server, one he'd set up months ago to preserve footage in case of system failure, and he'd watched Sterling's fingers move across the keyboard at 11:56 p.m., watched the files get flagged for deletion, watched the timestamp metadata record it all like gospel. Webb opened his laptop and showed Administrator Mora everything in chronological order. The harassment. The institutional escalation. The deliberate, documented, time-stamped evidence destruction. Webb's voice, when he spoke, was the flat tone of someone delivering facts. I blocked the deletion at the protocol level. He couldn't have known. But he tried. Everything you're looking at is intact. Mora looked at the screen and understood, with the clarity of a man watching his own judgment fail in real time, that he'd been played by Sterling's institutional confidence, that Sterling had walked these halls with such absolute certainty that Mora had inherited that certainty without question. That was the dangerous thing about authority, it was contagious. You caught it from proximity to someone who wore it well. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 the next morning in a conference room on the 15th floor. Patricia Hendricks attended. The board member Sterling had called in for favors, and she brought written testimony that detailed Sterling's pressure tactics with the precision of someone who'd suddenly remembered her ethical obligations. The FBI agents provided testimony in a closed session about Katie's classified service, about the voluntary separation from active duty, about the federal protection order that should have prevented any background investigation whatsoever. The state nursing board representative withdrew the investigation into Katie with a formal apology transmitted within 12 hours. The Colorado Medical Board opened an investigation into Sterling for harassment, falsification of complaints, and evidence tampering. By 72 hours, Sterling was suspended without pay pending a disciplinary hearing. By 2 weeks, his hospital privileges were permanently revoked. The news picked up the story within days. Prominent Denver surgeon investigated for harassment of decorated veteran nurse, and Sterling's private practice patients began canceling appointments. The call started immediately. Insurance companies began requesting credential reviews. His colleagues, the ones who'd lunched with him monthly, stopped returning emails. His attorney negotiated a settlement that avoided criminal prosecution. Sterling would surrender his medical license voluntarily, pay a $50,000 fine to the hospital's Veteran Support Fund, and never work in healthcare again. It was a sentence written in silence and loss of status, the kind of fall that happened not with dramatic violence but with the slow compression of every door closing simultaneously. Katie watched from the hospital break room window as Sterling cleaned out his office on a Thursday afternoon. 3 boxes of personal items, the ones that had seemed so important in a surgical suite, now reduced to cardboard and tape. His expensive Italian leather shoes, the ones that clicked against tile with the rhythm of authority, were gone, replaced by discount sneakers from a big box store. His medical journals, his framed board certifications, his photo with the hospital CEO at some donor event 5 years ago, all packed away with the efficiency of a man moving through the motions of his own diminishment. Katie didn't feel satisfaction. She felt the particular emptiness that comes from understanding that justice and healing are two different things entirely. Sarah Chen stood beside her, silent solidarity made manifest in presence alone. Marcus Webb brought coffee without being asked, black, no sugar, exactly how he'd seen her drink it in the break room over the past 3 days. Jacob Chen, recovering steadily in room 403 with his hearing aids adjusted and his daughter translating his signs into words, had sent a message through Sarah. He says thank you for saving him twice. The first time was Sanjin. The second time was now. The math of it was simple and devastating. There was no equation that could balance those scales. 6 months later, Katie stood in the Mercy General lobby accepting the hospital's Civilian Nursing Excellence Award from Administrator Morrison himself. The small crystal plaque was heavy in her hands, heavier than its weight suggested, carrying the gravity of 9 months of destruction and reconstruction. She wore her dress uniform, not navy dress blues, which she was forbidden to wear, but the crisp white civilian ceremony attire that fit like borrowed skin, like costumes other people wore. Sarah Chen sat in the front row beside her father Jacob, who watched Katie's face with clear recognition now, his eyes bright with the kind of understanding that transcends hearing. Marcus Webb stood at the back in his security uniform, arms crossed, nodding once, the smallest gesture of the particular respect that passes between people who've done hard things. The FBI agents had sent flowers. The plaque would go on her apartment wall beside the empty space where medals could never hang, the Navy Cross, the 2 silver stars, the Purple Heart, all locked in a storage unit she visited once a year in November, all on a shelf beside her husband's ashes and a folded flag that meant more than she could articulate. After the ceremony ended, after the handshakes and the photographs and the words that people spoke because they felt obligated to speak them, Katie walked to the break room and looked out the window across the street toward the strip mall parking lot. There, at a folding table between a nail salon and a vape shop, sat Dr. Sterling in a cheap polyester jacket, selling supplemental insurance policies to anyone who slowed down. A handwritten sign in marker read low rates. His hair had grayed visibly in 6 months, stress etched into the lines around his eyes like a map of his descent. He looked up once, met Katie's gaze across the distance, and looked away quickly, not from shame, but from the recognition of a man who'd finally understood the architecture of his own irrelevance. Katie didn't smile. She touched the unit patch inside her jacket lining, Thomas's Ranger tab, transferred to her after the funeral, worn next to her heart like a permanent wound. She returned to her shift without ceremony. Room for 12 needed medication. Room for 07 needed vitals checked. Room for 03 was Jacob Chen, who greeted her with a sign thank you in American Sign Language, his fingers moving with the fluency of someone who'd finally learned how to be heard in silence. As she left his room, Marcus Webb intercepted her in the hallway with a grin that cracked his careful composure. You know what they say, Senior Chief, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Katie's response was barely audible, the same quiet competence that had defined her through all of this, through Sanjin and Denver and the long walk between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Heroes do their jobs. That's all this was. But her hands, steady as surgical instruments for 18 years, trembled infinitesimally as she reached for the next patient chart, and no one but Webb saw it, and he said nothing, because some silences are earned. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, please subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors walking among us. Like this video, comment with your thoughts on Katie's journey, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one again.